Adobe's CC Suite has been my main creative platform for a few years now, but some YouTubers still rely on Vegas Pro, formerly of Sony but now developed by Magix, mainly because it was easy to pirate. For shame, please try out the plethora of high-quality free or open-source tools out there instead. But that's besides the point. We can debate all day whether the tools or UI of Vegas or Premiere is better. But what about render times? Can we lock down a legitimate, proper test of a render comparison between the two? This wound up being a huge rabbit hole to jump down, rather than a simple comparison. But let's take a look. Actually, I'm going to cut back here and just say this turned into a pretty complicated and technical adventure. The difference isn't a matter of A versus B, but how the two softwares utilize different optimizations. So if you want the cut and dry, too long, didn't watch answer, Premiere renders faster than Vegas, rendering in about half the time. But to me, why that happens is much more interesting. If you want to learn more, carry on. Sometimes video ideas, no matter how obvious the idea is, comes from the strangest places. So shout out to the friendly broski for suggesting the idea to me via Discord. I'm EposVox, here to make tech easier and more fun today, trying to compare render times on my machine versus Vegas Pro and Adobe Premiere Pro. I'm using the latest versions of each, Vegas Pro 14 and Adobe CC 2017, to take advantage of the latest optimizations. For hardware, I'm running this on my main rig, an Intel Core i7-6900K CPU with a GTX 1080. My source footage files sit on my OS drive, a Intel 750 series NVMe SSD, and my target drive to render is a run-of-the-mill 2TB 7200 RPM desktop hard drive. In case you didn't know, rendering to a different disk than your source footage results in faster renders. Optimization tip number 1. Normally, my source footage resides on my Synology NAS, and I use a secondary SSD on my PC as a scratch disk and media cache location for Premiere. Actually, it's called cache. I always say cache and everyone says it's wrong. Whatever. Vegas doesn't let me customize this option, the cache location, however. So to keep things running smooth, I kept all of my files local to my machine, which is more of what most people would probably use anyway. For this test, I created a sample video edit. I chose 10 video clips of different resolutions, frame rates, and codecs to stress the render. 1080p 60 gameplay from my Elgato, 4K 60 desktop recordings from OBS, 4K 60 gameplay recordings from NVIDIA Shadowplay, 1080p 30 webcam recordings, 1080p 60 camcorder shots, and so on. I also had two 1080p 60 alpha channel overlay lower third clips that I used in the edit. I first created the edit in Vegas, taking note of the order and time codes of each clip I used so that I could successfully recreate this in Premiere. This was tedious, especially since Vegas's trimmer is the worst, but I got it done. My final video was about 5 minutes and 8 seconds or so, ready to be rendered at 1080p 60 FPS and 4K 30 FPS. I did that so we could compare resolutions, frame rates, and scaling of various sizes within a more realistic edit. I also added some fade-ins and fade-outs to certain clips, a little contrast and saturation increases on a couple as well, so that way it wasn't just raw converting footage. This is what drives me nuts about render time comparisons, is when they don't do any actual editing, they just throw some footage on a timeline. That's just transcoding. That's way different than editing an actual video edit. But this brought me to my next problem. There's two standard MP4 render options that YouTubers use within Vegas: Main Concept MP4 and Sony AVC MVC MP4. So I needed to render each for both formats so I can see which one of those was faster too. Except the Sony AVC MVC option does not allow for a high enough bitrate for my 4K 30 render settings. It maxes out around 26 megabits per second, which is not enough for 4K. Also, Adobe Premiere has a max render quality toggle in its render settings. This increases the quality of the scaling engine during video renders, which can sometimes slow it down. I also rendered this without and with it on, so that we can compare those times as well. I've got to drink some water because the results are pretty great. It's gonna be a lot of talking. Are you ready? Here are the results. In Vegas, Sony AVC MVC MP4 rendered faster than Main Concept MP4, taking only 8 minutes 46 seconds to render the 1080p 60 file, whereas Main Concept took about 10 minutes and 24 seconds. Oddly enough, Sony AVC MVC also produced a much smaller file, at about 555 megabytes with an average bitrate of 15 megabits per second, versus the 1.10 gigabyte file with Main Concept. I tried to put the same bitrate roughly in for each. Don't know what happened. I did this twice. I don't know. However, Premiere Pro blew this time out of the park. It's worth mentioning here that AME, Adobe Media Encoder, often takes a long time to write file metadata to the actual video file after the render process has completed. This can take anywhere up to 5 minutes for really obnoxious files. The render is done, CPU usage drops back down to 0 or whatever, but it does not finish just yet. Because of this, I took note of both the time elapsed shown in AME once it finished the actual render, and the total render time from AME's text log when it showed that the metadata writing was also complete. For the 1080p 60 render, Premiere Pro took 4 minutes and 55 seconds to render the file, 5 minutes and 15 seconds total with metadata, with max render quality on. With max render quality turned off, that dropped to 4 minutes 53 seconds and 5 minutes 4 seconds with the metadata. That's almost half the amount of time that Sony Vegas took. Insane! With the big CC 2017 update, Adobe has kicked its serious ass with performance optimizations. I've been impressed in recent months of using it, but it's nice to see it actually quantified in front of me. We see similar results with the 4K 30 FPS render. Main concept in Vegas Pro took about 17 minutes and 29 seconds to render, while Premiere took 8 minutes and 31 seconds with max render quality on, 8 minutes 22 seconds with max render quality off. Again, half of the time to render in Premiere. And this render would have been much quicker, at least on Adobe's side, if not for the 4K 60 Guild Wars 2 gameplay footage I threw in. This is a very high bitrate and insanely detailed video file that I could actually see slow the render to a halt compared to the other footage in the video. But compared to Vegas, it still flew through it. It was about at this point that I realized that I might have given Premiere an unfair advantage, just due to the natural workflow that I use in Adobe Suite. As I mentioned before, I utilize a dedicated SSD within my system for the media cache files and scratch disks in Adobe. This speeds up video editing tremendously, especially when I'm editing footage shared over the network. This isn't an option in Vegas. I set every setting I could to store temporary files from the program to that SSD, but it always stores audio, peak files, and such next to the source footage. It's just an inherent part of the program. That doesn't appear to be an option one can change at all. I did research and found threads going back to the early 2000s requesting this feature, but to no avail. This is actually what led me to render my main C drive instead of over the network in the first place, as Vegas created peak files over the network was slow as molasses and just froze the program entirely. This did potentially give Premiere an advantage, I thought, since it was utilizing a feature that Vegas could not use. So I changed the project settings to store peak and cache files next to the source footage, closed Premiere, deleted the old files, opened it back up and allowed it to generate new data, and rendered again, expecting a slowdown, maybe results more similar to Vegas. Nope, 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 nope. I was way wrong. Renders went faster, marginally. Since the drive the files were stored on was a PCIe NVMe drive that is way faster than my normal scratch disk SSD and can handle random reads and writes much quicker, this setup actually shaved a few seconds off of the renders. The 1080p 60 file rendered at 4 minutes and 51 seconds, and the 4K 30 file rendered in 8 minutes 24 seconds. Both of these are with maximum render quality on. Of course, I need to continue using the SSD cache while editing from my network storage, but this was an interesting comparison. I am getting another M.2 NVMe SSD in soon for a review and sponsored video, so I may set that up as my cache and scratch drive moving forward, because that looks like it just speeds up rendering quite a bit. The SSD cache, scratch disk, and peak file storage is just one optimization boost with Premiere. The other being a reliance on CUDA accelerated rendering. Vegas is infamous for not doing a very good job at this. It recognizes my GTX 1080 and knows to use it, but that didn't seem to matter.
In the United States, ISPs can now sell your browsing history and data, as internet privacy rules were just rolled back. Don't want that to happen? Then it's time to set up a VPN. TunnelBear is offering a free 3-day trial of their awesome VPN service for the next month or so. Hide your data, keep your browsing history safe, behind a bear. Check the link in the description below or head to eposvox.com/freebear to learn more.
Either way, this was quite the interesting little adventure. I love doing stuff like this. I just don't always have the right motivation. Want to see more? Leave me a suggestion in the comments down below. Otherwise, smash the like button if you enjoyed, get subscribed for more awesome tech videos and just rabbit holes of tech madness like today, and I'll catch you in the next one.